Michael Oman-Reagan is a space anthropologist. He's very popular on the internet. He has an astounding following, not just an astounding following, but a very reactive, responsive following. People quote him and interact with him regularly on on a number of different matters, ranging from space and science to gender and issues having to do with race, and also industry and technology. So there you go. Thank you. Thank you for being here. Hand for Michael.
It's amazing to be here. You've all been really inspiring, and it's been fun to talk to a lot of you in the breaks. Those of you I haven't talked to, I hope I get a chance to later tonight for whoever's sticking around. So I'm a PhD candidate and a Vanier Scholar at Memorial University in Canada. And I need to tell you that this research is supported by the Department of Anthropology there at Memorial and also by the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada. They pay the bills. So my talk will be about 20 minutes. Before I start, I want to recognize that we've been meeting on the territory of the Ohlone people. They're the original people of this land, and their territory extends all the way to San Francisco. They're a living people with a living culture, and you can learn more about them on their website, which is listed right here. This is Indigenous Peoples Day, if you didn't know that, today. As an anthropologist, I study space, science, imagination, and futures. In my current research, I'm studying interstellar exploration. Today, I'm going to give you some sense of that research, and to start at the beginning, I'm going to talk about what anthropology is. Anthropology is an umbrella term that covers 4 different subdisciplines: linguistics, study of language; archaeology, study of material culture; cultural and social anthropology; and biological and physical anthropology, the study of human evolution, primate physiology, genetics, things like that. So I have training in all of these, and my graduate degree is in all 4, but my specialization in my PhD work is in social and cultural anthropology, which is what I'll be talking about today. I like this definition from Tim Ingold. He's an anthropologist at the University of Aberdeen. He says anthropology is a generous, open-ended, comparative, and yet critical inquiry into the conditions and possibilities of human life in the one world we all inhabit. But I would change it a bit. For the work I do, I would expand this to an inquiry into the conditions and possibilities of interactions among all life and things across many places and worlds we and others inhabit or may inhabit in the future. Possibilities is a really important idea for me because I think about the future a lot in my research. The anthropology of space is not new. There's a history of work on SETI, on interstellar migration, and on a lot of other topics. Right after humans first walked on the moon, anthropologists were talking about how to study our new cultures in space in a series of meetings in the 1970s, which led to publishing this book. Magora Maruyama is the futurist and anthropologist who was involved in this. In the 80s, anthropologist Ben Finney combined his experience in the Navy and aerospace industry with research on Polynesian people crossing the Pacific. He used this to explain human migration to the stars as part of an ancient and ongoing story of how humans migrate across the world and adapt to new places. And in 1994, anthropologist Roland Fulks proposed possible names for the anthropology of space. He said maybe astroanthropology, exoanthropology, or extraterrestrial anthropology. In 2009, anthropologists argued that since being earthbound is not a limitation for humans, it shouldn't be for anthropologists either. So over the last few decades, anthropologists have written about dozens of space topics, including European launch sites, Mars analog research that we heard about from Susan, responses to the threat of asteroid impact, cosmonaut diaries, companies and communities in the new space industry, and how we make space into a meaningful place in this recent book by Lisa Messeri, Placing Outer Space from Duke University Press. So what does it mean to do anthropology of interstellar space? I work with astronomers across North America. I study organizations and efforts like Icarus Interstellar, 100-Year Starship, and Breakthrough Starshot. I also work with SETI scientists, and I look at how we talk about interstellar space through science fiction as well. So I'll give you a few examples of this and what this looks like by talking about Voyager, SETI, and then Star Trek. And I'll conclude with a way that anthropology can help us think about our future in space. First, Voyager. After taking the famous pale blue dot photo in 1990, Voyager recorded another first in 2013. The sound of waves of particles wiggling interstellar plasma. And when scientists looked at this, along with older data from 2012, they said this was the sound of interstellar space. This moment marked the beginning of Voyager's interstellar mission. But where does interstellar space really begin? Scientists have told me the boundary could be described as anywhere from the heliopause out to the furthest objects orbiting the sun. But in 2013, NASA said Voyager is in interstellar space, the space between the stars. So Voyager became the first human-made object to leave our solar system. But a reanalysis of that data suggested that Voyager is still traveling through a muddied region and won't reach the pristine area of interstellar space until 2025. So Voyager is in interstellar space, and it was in 2012, a year before we found out in 2013, or maybe it isn't even there yet at all. By crossing a scientific horizon of interstellar space, we found another horizon to cross into pristine interstellar space. So having already entered interstellar space, we continue to talk about how we might get there. Writing about the history of what it means to actually be in a place, philosopher Michel Foucault said, "The real scandal of Galileo's work lay not so much in his discovery or rediscovery that the Earth revolved around the sun, but in his constitution of an infinite and infinitely open space." So interstellar space is tricky. In Euro-American culture, people like things to be clear-cut, to begin and end, to be one thing or another. But by studying science and space anthropologically, we see a lot of things aren't actually like that. I grew up under clear night skies in rural Eastern Oregon. And it's in places like that where you can hear interstellar space saying, "I'm here, available, conceivable," but also distant, impossible, beyond. That trickster nature of interstellar space is part of why we develop so many concepts to try and understand and explain it. You probably know this visualization, which shows the location of our galaxy within a local supercluster of galaxies. The name chosen for this scientific object, Laniakea, means immeasurable heaven in Hawaiian. So how do we study and think about these immeasurable places? In his research, MIT anthropologist Stefan Helmreich argues that the materiality of the world shouldn't be separated from the formalisms we use to describe it. In other words, formalisms, like these scientific visualizations of galactic superclusters and the boundary of where interstellar space begins. So these are both scientific things that are empirical and real, but they're also formal things that are conceptual and cultural. Like most things in our world, interstellar space is a hybrid. Philosopher Timothy Morton writes about these kind of hybrid things at huge scales, objects like nuclear waste and climate change. He calls them hyperobjects. Hyperobjects are gigantic non-human entities that are massively distributed in time and space relative to humans. The idea of the hyperobject is really useful for thinking about all sorts of big things, like our magnetosphere, for example. Hyperobjects are so distributed across time and space that Morton says there is no human even worth talking about at this scale. Their vastness seems to erase both the human subject and our present time. That's a fitting description of the feeling you can get when you're standing here on Earth looking up at the Milky Way and thinking about interstellar space. Morton's idea of a hyperobject describes a thing like interstellar space that defies everything we think we know about things. They're the ultimate trickster. It's real, but it's also profoundly withdrawn, so we can never totally see it. Just when you think you start to see it, it recedes. Turns out you've only seen a reflection or an edge of it. So in my research, I look at all the ways we explore beyond our solar system, how we try to know these seemingly unknowable things. And imagination is obviously one of the ways we do this, especially how we talk about space in the search for extraterrestrial intelligence and in science fiction. First, a little bit about SETI. In February 2015, scientists met to talk about returning to METI, or active transmission. Not just listening, but transmitting, like David talked about on the first day, which is sometimes called active SETI. In response, 28 people signed a statement on the dangers, warning of unknown and potentially enormous implications and consequences of active transmission, concluding that intentionally signaling other civilizations raises concerns about both the message and the consequences of contact. The people who signed this statement were expressing a perhaps justified fear of disaster. The word disaster, Timothy Morton also points out, comes from dis-astron, which means a fallen, dysfunctional, dangerous, or evil star. But for a star to be dysfunctional, it has to be deviating from some stable background. The possibility of intelligent life elsewhere in the universe appears here in these debates around METI as a disaster threatening our familiar human-centered universe. In response to these concerns, SETI's senior astronomer wrote a New York Times op-ed which concluded that the universe beckons. There we go. We can do better than to declare that future generations should endlessly tremble at the sight of the stars, so we might ask who or what is beckoning. In the debate about active transmission, the tables are turned in interstellar exploration. It's no longer a question of what we're going to learn about interstellar space, but what interstellar space might learn about us. These debates about sending messages change interstellar space from an empty frontier waiting for human exploration into a constellation of potentially inhabited worlds created by both science and imagination, especially through science fiction. Historian of science Colin Milburn has argued that science fiction can work like a repository of modifiable futures in science. And I think Star Trek: The Motion Picture is an underappreciated film, you can debate this with me later, that's a great way to think about the meeting of humanity, technology, extraterrestrial intelligence, and interstellar space. In the film, the crew of the Starship Enterprise is sent to investigate an enormous entity traveling through interstellar space toward Earth. After passing through the outer layer of huge energy clouds surrounding it, and entering the inconceivably huge ship within their own enormous space vessel, the crew finds this alien ship contains worlds and entire star systems, or at least representations of them, much like how we construct and store representations of stars, exoplanets, galaxies. At the center, they discover the mind behind this vast living intelligence, a machine entity named Voyager, described by one Star Trek fan site as one of the most extraordinary life forms ever encountered. The heart of this massive, evolving ship reveals that it was built around the Voyager 6 spacecraft, an imagined continuation of the Voyager program. Having been programmed to learn all that is learnable and return that knowledge to the Creator, Voyager 6 expanded and evolved into a sentient being who returned to Earth looking for that Creator. Voyager collected information across interstellar space and wanted to follow its programming, which also turned out to be its creation story. Timothy Morton has also written that the end of the world might not be an instant vaporization, something we're thinking about a lot right now, but instead a lingering coexistence with strange strangers. In the end of the film, Voyager decides it needs to merge with the human consciousness to overcome the limits of its logic-driven machine thinking. A crew member and Voyager become one, and this embodies a new relationship with interstellar space and might even hint at the future end of humanity as we know it, a lingering coexistence with strange strangers. In 1976, Star Trek creator Gene Roddenberry said, "The whole show was an attempt to say that humanity will reach maturity and wisdom on the day that it begins not just to tolerate, but to take a special delight in differences, in ideas and differences, in life forms, if we cannot learn to actually enjoy those small differences, take a positive delight in those small differences between our own kind here on this planet, then we do not deserve to go out into space and meet the diversity that is almost certainly out there. So as an anthropologist, I can help us understand the history of ideas that came from anthropology. Civilization is an especially interesting one. The idea of primitive versus advanced civilization is a really common one in space exploration, from SETI to interstellar migration, and also in science fiction. But this hierarchy isn't really a phenomenon of the world. It's an idea humans created, a cultural construct. It has a particular history that's useful to think about. So don't try and read this. This is a really complicated map of British and US Victorian anthropology in the 1850s and 1900s. It shows interrelationships between ideas and how they developed. But by looking at this history of theory, we can see origins of popular ideas that we often repeat without realizing where they come from. Zooming in, you can see some Victorian models for explaining how societies change over time here. Each one of these follows the same kind of path. In popular use, we've often combined them and mixed up technological change with religious difference and biological complexity, each one moving from an idea of so-called primitive to civilized, from simple to seemingly more complex, from so-called savagery to barbarism to civilization, from animism to polytheism to monotheism, from single cell to multicellular to the body. The civilizational hierarchies emerged from the belief that Europeans were the pinnacle of human society. They saw themselves as the only rational, complex, and civilized people in the world. So they believed that some other people on Earth over time might change to become more like Europeans, especially with help from benevolent colonizers, a lesson often enforced with violence. That was their definition of progress. But these hierarchical, one-directional models of progressive social evolutionism continue to influence popular ideas today. They also influence how we think about our present, our past, and our futures, as well as possible extraterrestrial civilization. And the effect of that can be to replace understanding the value of difference with an idea that becoming more the same, more homogeneous, more like Euro-American culture is the same thing as progress. But these outdated hierarchies were abandoned long ago by the very fields that created them, because they're both unscientific and not good at explaining cultural and social change. Not to mention being core ideologies that were used to justify genocide, slavery, and other violence. That's not progress. Instead, progress might be an understanding of culture and civilization that recognizes the value of diversity and difference. When we bring diversity into space, we bring a repository of technologies and infrastructures from across the planet. All the incredible tools humanity has developed over thousands of years for adapting to new environments, for communicating, for problem solving, collaborating, surviving. Everything our species has learned by watching the Earth, by adapting to all the life and processes on this planet. This was demonstrated brilliantly by Alice's talk yesterday on the values, technologies, and traditions that have allowed people to survive in the high Arctic. We learn, grow, and change as a species by working across divides, finding ways to do that, overcoming problems of translation between disciplines, ideologies, experiences, cultures, and other differences. We innovate by building on what others across the globe have done before us as part of a grand human history. We always revolutionize by changing our perspectives, challenging seemingly natural worldviews, learning from others who are different. Culture, as a result, is always shifting, recombining, synthesizing. And this is precisely what makes us capable of becoming a spacefaring species. So cultural infrastructure is a concept we could use to describe not only the technology we need to keep a human body alive in space, but the wide range of different cultures, traditional knowledge, and wisdom we need to build real futures in space and to survive on Earth. When we go into space, we bring culture with us. We bring worldview, perspective, history, practices, traditions, stories. Those all tell us something about the kind of futures that we imagine. So imagination is not only inspiration, it's also a kind of cultural infrastructure. As Juan said yesterday, what we need are imaginary triggers. And culture and imagination might be the most important infrastructures we need to go back to the moon, on to Mars, and beyond into interstellar space. And to do it in a way that builds a future where things are better than today. The first step to justice for everyone is imagining justice as possible. As science fiction author Ursula K. Le Guin wrote, "We will not be free if we do not imagine freedom. We cannot demand that anyone try to attain justice and freedom who has not had a chance to imagine them as attainable." Astronomer Jason Wright and I talk about some of these issues, including science fiction and human futures, in a new paper. It will be out soon in the International Journal of Astrobiology, so keep a lookout for that. And since I used Star Trek, I want to point out some other more innovative examples of science fiction that include diverse interstellar cultural infrastructures. You may have read some of these. And there are many more. I'd love to hear what you all are reading later. And to conclude, I want to borrow from Alan Watts, who said, "We do not come into this world, we come out of it." So considering that we're star stuff, we might want to say, we do not go out into interstellar space, we came from it, and hope one day to return. Thank you.
Questions for Michael?
I'm happy to talk to people later also, so feel free to come up to me or give me an email.
Okay. Question? Olivia?
What do you want our main takeaway to be from this? Like, how can we implement these ideas going forward in our own lives?
One of the really interesting things that you mentioned was the large number of non-STEM people who are involved in SETs. And that's really interesting to me because there is an anthropology of space. And a lot of people don't know that. Some people know there's an archaeology of space, and they've heard of Dr. Alice Gorman and her work on space junk. And a lot of people may follow her on Twitter. But we need to think interdisciplinary. We need to think in terms of interdisciplinarity. We need to think about how it's not just STEM. And there are insights to gather from anthropology, from sociology. There's an Institute of Astrosociology that Jim Pass runs. It's really interesting and worth looking into. So I would say, what can we learn from all kinds of difference, as you mentioned, disciplinary difference as well? Yeah.
Thanks, fascinating. I thought it was very striking when you began your talk by saying we're sitting on an Ohlone land site here.
Yeah.
You know, the Native American population that lived here before the Europeans showed up 500 years ago or whenever that was. And so my mind is spinning and I'm thinking, oh, this guy's an anthropologist. I bet he does that at the beginning of every talk, you know, whatever town he's in, he reminds people of that. And so I wondered if the Ohlone Indians had any stories about space travel.
This is a really good question. There are a couple of great books which you can find if you just search your library or look online about Native American stories about the sky, about the stars, about space. And there's one of the things I edit is a Medium publication that's called Space Anthropology. And there's an article on there by an anthropologist, Willie, and he writes about Native and Indigenous futures and Native science fiction. And if you go on, you look on Medium for space anthropology, you'll find his article about this incredible collection of Native American science fiction stories. One of them that's really cool is Navajo bringing corn to the moon. And in some of our conversations about what sort of plants we're going to be growing on the moon, People have talked about whether corn is useful and what you get, left over after you harvest corn and what do you do with that. And it's a really interesting film produced by Native people about imagining how indigenous wisdom might be useful in trying to settle Mars or the moon or places, just like we saw in Alice's talk, that are very similar sometimes to the extreme environments here on Earth that humans have adapted to all across the globe. So I think there's a lot to learn from people all over the Earth.
Thank you. Great presentation, by the way. You've mentioned natives and how they've lived here and their entire culture, and how a lot of what they speak of is star people. And I was just interested in what's your take on it, or what have you studied that relates to, I don't want to say the coined term ancient aliens, but the concept of star people and their knowledge of outer space, of outer meaning, outside of the Earth, outside of even galaxy or beyond.
I mean, I think that it's really fun to think about, all the von Daniken stuff and Ancient Aliens and the Stargate series and the whole mythology that develops around that. It's fun to think about because it's a story that we tell. It's a part of our mythology through science fiction. And it says a lot about how we underestimate human ability to survive and adapt, to construct things. We underestimate human ability to make the pyramids, to do a lot of things on Earth that humans have done as we've moved around the globe. And so we tell stories about humans needing help from gods, from aliens. And then you have actual native traditions, beliefs, mythologies. And those are worth investigating and understanding in the terms of those cultures as they tell them, as their stories. So I wouldn't necessarily speak on those, not really my place per se. But you can look to native people all around the world for their stories about the stars.
Yeah, thanks for your interesting talk. What we all accept is that science fiction never comes out of the blue. It's always a reflection of the society it's being created in. I'm just interested in how you look at this, if you can share anything about this. On one hand, maybe, do you see an evolution within science fiction that might be interesting to be shared now? Or do you see some contemporary trends in science fiction that are relatively new that reflect changes in society, either political or technological?
That's a great question. In this article that's coming out that Jason and I wrote, we talk a lot about science fiction, and we kind of have these different views of it. He was particularly concerned with what he calls the giggle factor, which is a big deal for SETI and SETI funding. That people see SETI proposals and they laugh at them because, if you're searching for little green men, you're not going to get money. And he sees this kind of getting reinforced sometimes by science fiction. I, on the other hand, have spent my whole life inspired by science fiction, and I've always felt that it was sort of more motivating and that it's the reason that people might want to fund SETI proposals, because they think, well, how incredible would this be? This might be the greatest possible discovery in the history of humanity to see that we're truly not alone. So we talk a lot about science fiction in that. We also talk about how science fiction has, in the past, reproduced a lot of stereotypes and caused a lot of problems. I grew up reading Heinlein, for example, and then you look at some of his work and some of it's a bit sexist and a bit racist, and, well, people are products of their time, right? So maybe I don't like it as much now as I did then, but I still enjoyed reading it, and it still got me inspired to think about space. Other people might have read it when they were kids and thought, well, this doesn't represent me at all. But there is a lot of science fiction that's really boundary challenging, and we talk about that also in the paper. I'm personally a big fan of Ursula Le Guin's work because it's politically challenging. It talks about an interstellar migration of humanity and humans living on other worlds for so long that they start to become alien to each other, which I think is really interesting. I love the Culture series. I think that's a fascinating political exploration that really answers a lot of the questions that Nick was bringing up the other day about what is this central project. Well, what is the central project of the culture? That's an interesting question to ask, for those who've read the series. If you have no scarcity and you can essentially produce anything, and you have, ships that contain the entirety of your civilization on them, and you're spread throughout the, galaxy, or one arm of the galaxy, what can you do? What do you want to do? What do you decide to do? How do you interact with people who aren't like that? And these are questions that reflect a lot about what we choose to do today as well. We're sitting here in the United States, which is the largest military empire on Earth. We talked about the military budget the other day. What if we took half of that and instead of dropping bombs, we built hospitals all around the world? That would really change the political structure of the world. Obviously, the culture does that sort of thing. They also get involved in wars. So there's a lot of really interesting debates. I could talk about science fiction all night and just ramble, so I'll stop there.
Any other questions? I'd like to say thank you, Michael Oman-Reagan.
Thank you.
I'd recommend following him on Twitter, Oman-Reagan.